The blue glow of the monitors was the only light in the private surveillance room, casting sharp, unforgiving shadows across the jagged ink of the tiger tattoo that climbed Tuck Sun Ho's neck. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, the silence of the Gim Gang estate pressing against his ears like a physical weight. On the screen, the timestamp flickered in a sickly green. 2:34 a.m. Sun Ho's jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. He had built an empire on the cold math of loyalty and the reading of a man's pulse before he even thought of a betrayal. Yet here it was, a breach in his own fortress. Through the grainy night vision feed of the industrial kitchen, Shannon Culver moved like a ghost through a graveyard. The American chef, whom he had hired out of a fleeting moment of misplaced mercy, looked furtive and guilty. She glanced over her shoulder twice, her eyes wide and reflecting the infrared light of the cameras like a startled animal, before she began wrapping several loaves of fresh artisanal bread and a heavy thermos in a kitchen towel. She tucked the bundle under her white chef's coat, her hands shaking as she smoothed the fabric to hide the bulge. To Sun Ho, every tremor in her fingers was a confession. He leaned forward, his Rolex catching the cold light of the screen. He had seen this story 1,000 times in the underworld, a desperate outsider, drowning in debts back in Dallas, looking at his premium inventory and seeing a way out. Ms. Bong Cha, the head housekeeper who had been like a mother to him since his father's death, had warned him about this. She had brought him the reports, the vanishing Hanwoo beef, the imported matsutake mushrooms, the expensive bone broths that cost more than a common man's monthly salary. Americans are always desperate, Bong Cha had whispered with a look of practiced concern. She's likely selling your stock to the black market restaurants in Itaewon to pay off her failures. It made perfect sense. In Sun Ho's world, people didn't do things for nothing. There was always a price, always a ledger. Watching Shannon now, he felt a familiar, cold twist in his chest. He had wanted to be wrong. He had wanted the kitchen to be the one place in his life that wasn't a battlefield. His finger hovered over the intercom, ready to summon his security team. One phone call and Shannon would be handled. He wasn't a savage. He wouldn't kill her. But he would ensure she left Seoul with enough fear in her bones to never utter his name again. But as she disappeared from the kitchen feed, she didn't head for the back exit. She turned down the hallway toward the west wing, the forbidden corridor that housed his mother's private suite. Sun Ho's pulse quickened. The west wing was a sanctuary, a place Ms. Bong Cha had explicitly told Shannon never to enter under the guise of protecting his mother's delicate health. He switched the feed to the hallway cameras. Shannon was moving quickly now, her shadow stretching long against the traditional wood-paneled walls. She reached the ornate door at the end of the hall, her hand hesitating on the brass handle before she slipped inside. Sun Ho felt the air in the room turn to ice. This was no longer just a petty theft. This was an intrusion into the most vulnerable part of his life. He reached for his phone, the weight of the device a familiar promise of retribution. Yet, something stayed his hand. A different camera activated, the motion-triggered military-grade unit he had installed inside his mother's bedroom when her health began its steep, inexplicable decline. The screen flickered to life, showing the mahogany furniture and the expensive hospital bed. His mother sat on the edge, skeletal and frail, her designer silk pajamas hanging off her frame like a burial shroud. Even through the digital grain, he could see the hollows of her cheeks and the limp fall of her gray hair. She looked like a woman who had already died but forgotten to stop breathing. Then, Shannon entered the frame. Sun Ho's breath stopped in his throat. He expected to see a struggle, or perhaps the thief hiding her loot in the room's shadows. Instead, Shannon knelt at his mother's feet. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the towel, revealing the stolen bread and the steaming thermos. As she opened the lid, a faint wisp of steam rose into the air. His mother's eyes, which Bong Cha claimed had lost all focus to dementia, suddenly came alive, desperate and focused on the food. Sun Ho watched, paralyzed, as the American chef he was about to discard gently guided his mother's shaking hands. Shannon pulled out a spoon, filled it with a rich, golden broth, and brought it to the old woman's cracked lips. His mother opened her mouth like a starving bird, consuming the liquid with a ferocity that shattered Sun Ho's heart. In the corner of the monitor, he saw the official dinner tray sitting on the dresser, completely empty. The same tray Bong Cha had sworn his mother had refused to touch earlier that night. The blue glow of the room suddenly felt like a spotlight on a crime he hadn't realized was being committed. 3 weeks earlier, the air in the estate's industrial kitchen had felt thick enough to choke on. Shannon Culver stood in the center of the gleaming stainless steel cathedral, her hands knotted behind her back to hide the tremor in her fingers. The space was a marvel of modern engineering. Viking ranges, sub-zero freezers, and prep stations that looked more like surgical theaters than places of craft. But for all its luxury, the atmosphere was ice cold. 6 Korean kitchen staff members moved around her with practiced military efficiency, while their eyes sliding over her American chef's coat as if she were a smudge of grease on a pristine mirror. They spoke in rapid-fire Korean, a language that sounded to Shannon like a wall she was destined to run into headfirst. She didn't need a translator to understand the sneers or the way they purposely bumped her shoulder as they moved toward the walk-in. To them, she was contaminated air, an unwanted interloper forced upon them by the boss's inexplicable whim. She was a woman who had lost everything: a failed restaurant in Dallas, a mountain of debt that followed her across the Pacific, and a pride that was currently being ground into the tile floor. "Ms. Culver?" The voice was like a blade through silk. Shannon turned to find Ms. Bong Cha standing in the doorway. The head housekeeper was a vision of severe elegance. She was wearing a black handbook that looked stiff enough to stand on its own. Her silver hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a mask of eternal judgment. Everything about her radiated an authority that even the most hardened syndicate soldiers respected. "I am Ms. Bong Cha. I oversee all domestic operations. You will report to me, and only to me." Her English was immaculate, flavored with a sharp British-educated edge. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't even offer a smile. Instead, her eyes traveled over Shannon with a dismissive assessment, lingering on the slight fraying of Shannon's sleeves. "Let us be clear. You are here because Mr. Tuck requires a Western palate for certain business associates. That is the extent of your value. You are a tool, nothing more. You will prepare what you are told. When you are told, you will not explore. You will not ask questions. And you will certainly not speak unless a superior addresses you." Shannon nodded, her throat feeling as though it were lined with sand. "I understand, ma'am. I just want to work." Bong Cha stepped closer, her shadow falling over Shannon's station. "There is one rule that carries the penalty of immediate termination, or, worse, the West Wing, 3rd floor. Mr. Tuck's mother resides there in a state of delicate health. She requires absolute silence and the specialized care of her medical staff. Under no circumstances are you to go near that wing. It is forbidden. Do I make myself clear?" "Perfectly," Shannon whispered. "Good. Don't make me regret convincing Mr. Tuck to hire an American. It was a gamble I am already starting to doubt." With a sharp turn, Bong Cha vanished, her footsteps echoing like a ticking clock down the marble hallway. The moment she was gone, the kitchen erupted in whispers. Shannon caught the word "Wegugin," foreigner, spat like a curse. Chef Kong, a man with a face like carved granite, gestured toward a back corner station tucked behind a massive cooling pillar. It was the furthest point from the main action, isolated and shadowed. He pointed to a mountain of scallions and radishes that looked like they had been sitting out a few hours too long. "Prep!" he barked in choppy, grudging English. "Do not slow us down." Shannon moved to her corner, unpacking her knife kit with the rhythmic precision of a soldier cleaning a rifle. She knew the game. They would isolate her, sabotage her mise en place, and switch her labels until she looked like the incompetent outsider they believed her to be. And they expected her to break, to cry, or to pack her bags and flee back to the safety of Texas. What they didn't know was that Shannon had spent 2 years watching her grandmother fade away in a house that grew quieter every day. She knew how to survive in a place where no one wanted her. She knew how to find the cracks in the armor. As she began to slice through the radishes, the steel of her knife clicking rhythmically against the board, she kept her head down. But her eyes were already scanning the room, noticing the way Ms. Bongcha watched the service elevator with a hawk-like intensity, and the way the trays destined for the third floor were always covered, always secret, and always accompanied by a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like a burial. By the second week, the isolation of the back corner had become Shannon's vantage point. In the high-octane theater of the Gim Gang kitchen, she was a ghost, and ghosts saw things the living chose to ignore. She learned the rhythm of the house, the way the security details rotated like clockwork, and the precise moment every evening when the atmosphere shifted from professional chaos to a chilling, reverent hush. This hush always accompanied the preparation of the mother's tray. It was a ritual overseen personally by Ms. Bongcha. Chef Kong would abandon his post at the main range to prepare a delicate vegetable porridge or a steamed sea bass, using the finest porcelain and silver. The food was always beautiful, balanced and aromatic, designed to be the ultimate testament to the syndicate's filial piety. Ms. Bong Cha would inspect the tray with a jeweler's eye, adjust a single sprig of garnish, and then disappear into the service elevator, heading for the forbidden heights of the West Wing. Shannon would have found it touching, if not for the waste. It happened for the third night in a row, just as the clock neared midnight. Shannon was scrubbing down her station, her back aching from 16 hours of menial labor, when the service elevator dilled. The doors slid open and Ms. Bong Cha stepped out, the silver tray balanced in her hands. Shannon expected to see the usual remnants of a meal, a half-empty bowl, a used napkin, the messy reality of an elderly woman with diminishing motor skills. Instead, the tray was pristine. The sea base was perfectly intact, its skin glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. The porridge hadn't been stirred, and the steam had simply condensed into a cold, translucent film over the surface. It was a masterpiece of culinary art that had clearly never been touched by a spoon. Shannon watched from the shadows of the cooling pillar as Ms. Bong Cha walked straight to the industrial trash compactor. With a flick of her wrist that was chillingly casual, the head housekeeper scraped the entire contents of the tray into the bin. The expensive fish, the hand-picked herbs, the labor of the kitchen, all of it disappeared into the dark maw of the machine. A pity. Ms. Bongcha's voice drifted across the room, though she didn't turn around. She knew Shannon was there. She could feel the American's gaze like a physical heat. Mr. Tuck's mother has become quite impossible. The dementia, you see. She has lost the will to live. She looks at food as if it were poison. Shannon stopped scrubbing, the damp rag heavy in her hand. She didn't even try a bite? It looks exactly as it did when it left the kitchen. Ms. Bongcha finally turned. The light reflected off her silver bun, making her look like a statue carved from ice. When the mind breaks, the body follows. It is heartbreaking for Mr. Tuck, of course. He pays for the best, yet she chooses to wither away. It is a waste of Chef Kong's talent. But we must maintain the appearance of care. We must keep trying, even if the result is always the same. She said it with a practiced, hollow sadness, the kind of tone people use when they've told a lie so many times it has become a script. She then walked to the sink, rinsed the porcelain herself, and left the room without another word. Shannon stood alone in the silence, the hum of the refrigerators sounding like a low-pitched scream. She had worked in nursing homes to put herself through culinary school. She had seen loss of will. She had seen patients who pushed food around their plates until it was a gray slurry, or those who threw their bowls in a fit of confusion. But she had never seen a starving woman leave a tray pristine. A chilling thought took root in her mind. The food wasn't being refused. It was being withheld. She looked at the trash compactor, then up at the ceiling toward the west wing. Ms. Bongcha wasn't bringing back the leftovers of a difficult patient. She was bringing back a prop from a stage play. If the mother was truly suffering from dementia-induced anorexia, there would be signs of a struggle to eat. Instead, there was only the perfection of an untouched plate. Shannon's heart hammered against her ribs. She thought of her own debts, the warnings about the dangerous nature of the Gim Gang syndicate, and the forbidden nature of the third floor. Every instinct told her to keep her head down, to keep scrubbing the stainless steel until her fingers bled, and to ignore the empty trays. But she could still hear the sound of the compactor, the sound of life-sustaining nourishment being treated as garbage, and she knew she couldn't look away. The fatigue had become a physical weight, a bone-deep exhaustion that made the world blur at the edges. It was past midnight, and Shannon had stayed 3 hours late to perfect a gochujang reduction, desperate to prove she wasn't just a Western tool to be discarded. When she finally hung up her apron, her mind was a fog of recipes and debt calculations. She took the service stairs, but in her haze, she pushed through the wrong fire door. The air changed instantly. The sterile, stainless steel scent of the industrial kitchen was replaced by the smell of aged cedar, expensive incense, and a cold, stagnant stillness. The floors were no longer poured concrete but thick, silk-woven carpets that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. Low-hanging paper lanterns cast long, flickering shadows against dark wood paneling. Shannon froze, her heart leaping into her throat. This wasn't the staff wing. The architecture was traditional, reverent, and utterly forbidden. She had stumbled into the West Wing. She turned to flee, but a sound stopped her. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, followed by a low, desperate whimper that sounded less like a human and more like a wounded animal. It was coming from behind an ornate set of sliding doors at the end of the gallery. Rationality screamed at her to run, to disappear before a security detail found her and handled her for trespassing. But Shannon had spent years listening to the sounds of a body failing. She knew the difference between a nightmare and a cry for help. She crept toward the door, her breath coming in shallow hitches. She pressed her ear to the wood. Silence. Then that scratching sound again, the sound of fingernails on glass. Shannon slid the door open just a fraction. The hinges let out a microscopic groan. The suite beyond was cavernous, a master bedroom converted into a high-tech hospice. A hospital bed sat in the center of the room, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of monitors and IV stands that stood like skeletal sentries. But the bed was empty. Shannon's eyes traveled to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the dark gardens. There, huddled in the moonlight, was a figure. It was the mother. She was wearing silk pajamas that might have cost thousands of dollars, but they hung off her frame like a shroud draped over a wire hanger. Her hair was a tangled silver bird's nest, and her skin was a translucent, sickly gray. The woman was on her knees, her face pressed against the cold window pane. Her tongue was out, darting across the glass with frantic, jerky motions. She was licking the condensation off the pane, her throat working in painful gulps as she tried to harvest the microscopic beads of moisture. Her fingernails clawed at the frame, desperate to find a way to the rain outside. "Oh my God," Shannon whispered, the sound escaping her before she could stop it. The woman spun around with a speed born of pure terror. She collapsed back against the glass, her eyes wide and wild. Even emaciated, her bone structure was regal, possessing the same sharp, predatory beauty as Sun Ho, but it was hollowed out by a primal, agonizing hunger. She didn't look like a woman with dementia. She looked like a prisoner of war. "Please," the woman rasped, her voice a dry crackle. She reached out a hand that was little more than skin stretched over knuckles. Please. Water. Food. Please. Shannon stepped into the room, her horror overriding her fear of the syndicate. She saw the dinner tray sitting on the mahogany dresser across the room. It was perfectly empty, wiped clean with a cloth, just as she had seen Ms. Bongcha return it to the kitchen. There wasn't even a stray grain of rice, or a drop of moisture in the teacup. They told me you wouldn't eat," Shannon said, her voice trembling as she knelt beside the woman. The mother grabbed Shannon's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, fueled by the adrenaline of a dying person. "Bong Cha. She brings empty plates. She tells my son I am difficult. She tells him I am crazy. But she brings nothing. Only the smell of the kitchen. Only the sound of the elevator." She began to sob, a dry, hacking sound because she had no tears left to shed. "I am so hungry. Please, child, I am so hungry." The beeping of the heart monitor spiked, a rhythmic warning of the woman's rising panic. Shannon looked at the door, then back at the skeletal woman. In that moment, in the failed restaurant in Dallas and the debt collectors didn't matter. The dangerous Tuck Sun Ho didn't matter. She realized that the empty trays weren't a result of a broken mind, but a calculated execution. "I'm coming back," Shannon whispered fiercely, leaning in close so the microphones wouldn't catch her. "I'm a chef. I'm going to bring you something. Real food. I promise, Young Hee. I promise." She slipped out of the room just as the heavy tread of a security guard echoed from the far end of the hallway. As she sprinted back toward the service stairs, her mind was already racing through the inventory, calculating what she could steal that wouldn't be missed and how to turn scraps into a lifeline. Shannon didn't just become a thief. She became a ghost in the machinery of the Gim Gang estate. The risk was no longer a theoretical threat of deportation or a lost job. It was the very real possibility of a shallow grave in the hills outside Seoul. Yet, every time she closed her eyes, she saw the moonlight reflecting off the window pane young. He had been licking for moisture. That image burned away her fear, replacing it with a cold culinary focus. She began her raids in the liminal spaces of the kitchen, the areas where the high-end waste was discarded. To the other staff, she was still the clumsy American relegated to the back corner, but Shannon was playing a much deeper game. She watched Chef Kong discard the trimmed ends of premium Hanwoo beef, rich, fatty scraps that were unfit for the boss's table but packed with the iron and protein a starving woman needed. She rescued the stems of shiitake mushrooms and the bruised outer leaves of napa cabbage, ingredients that were destined for the compost but held the essence of life in their fibers. Working in the dead of night, after the main staff had retreated to their wing and the heavy silence of the mansion set in, Shannon became an alchemist. She used a small battered pot she had purchased with her own meager pocket money, hiding it in the back of a locker behind sacks of industrial flour. She didn't make the elaborate, multi-course meals the house was famous for. Those would be too easy to spot on the monitors. Instead, she made the thief's porridge, a dense, nutrient-rich bone broth, thickened with rice that she had smuggled out a handful at a time. She stood over the stove, then her eyes darting toward the red light of the security camera in the corner. She knew she had a 30-minute window between the night guard's rounds. She kept the heat low, the blue flame a mere whisper against the copper bottom of the pot, ensuring no telltale steam or heavy scents would drift into the ventilation system. She added a drop of toasted sesame oil, just enough to provide the essential fats, Young Hee's body was screaming for, and strained the mixture until it was smooth enough for a throat that had forgotten how to swallow. The smuggling was the hardest part. She used a slim, vacuum-sealed thermos she'd bought at a local market, wrapping it in a damp kitchen towel to dampen any metallic clinking. She tucked it into the small of her back, beneath the stiff fabric of her chef's coat, the heat of the broth searing against her skin. Every step down the hallway toward the West Wing felt like a mile. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a gunshot. When she slipped into the darkened suite, The transition from the sterile, violent world of the syndicate to the quiet sanctuary of the bedroom was jarring. Young, he would be waiting, her eyes tracking the door with a desperate, animal-like intensity. Shannon would sit on the edge of the bed, her shadow merging with the older woman's, and begin the slow, rhythmic process of feeding her. Small sips, Shannon would whisper, her voice barely a breath. It's bone marrow and rice. It will help your heart. The transformation was slow, but undeniable. By the fourth night, Young Hee's hands stopped shaking so violently. By the end of the week, the gray, ash-like pallor of her skin had begun to give way to a faint, translucent glow. They spoke in whispers, a mix of broken English and the universal language of shared trauma. Young, he told her about Sun Ho as a boy, how he had been a sensitive child before the world of the syndicate had hardened him into a statue of ink and stone. She spoke of the housekeeper, Ms. Bongcha, and how the woman's loyalty had curdled into a slow, patient greed. Shannon realized she wasn't just stealing food, she was stealing time. Every spoonful was a minute added to Young Hee's life, a minute that Ms. Bongcha was trying to subtract. Shannon's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the scale of the war she had joined. She was a lone American woman with a thermos of soup, standing against a centuries-old hierarchy of violence and betrayal. But as she watched Young Hee's throat work, swallowing the life-giving broth with tears of gratitude in her eyes, Shannon knew she couldn't stop. She was the only thing standing between this woman and the trash compactor. The predator's instinct in Ms. Bongcha was not sharpened by violence, but by the quiet, obsessive accounting of a woman who owned every shadow in the estate. She did not need to see a crime to know one was being committed. She felt it in the shifting weight of the house. For decades, she had maintained a perfect vacuum where the mother's life used to be, and any sudden influx of hope was a threat to the void she had carefully curated. It began with the bone pile. A professional kitchen has a soul of its own, and Bongcha knew the exact volume of scrap that should hit the bin each night. When the scrap pile grew thin, and the level in the rice bin dropped by a fraction more than the formal menus required, she didn't call for a repairman. She called for a ledger. She spent 3 nights cross-referencing the inventory with the security logs, her eyes narrowing as she found the common denominator: Shannon Culver. The American was staying late, moving in the blind spots of the cooling pillars and lingering near the storage lockers. Bongcha didn't care about the food itself. To her, the ingredients were just bait. She saw an opportunity to finalize the removal of the one variable she couldn't control. Shannon was an outsider, a woman with no roots and a mountain of debt, making her the perfect vessel for a narrative of betrayal. The manipulation began in the low light of Sun Ho's private study. Bongcha entered without knocking, her handbag rustling like dry leaves. She didn't lead with an accusation. She led with a motherly sigh, a heavy, performative weight that she knew would snag Sun Ho's attention. He looked up from his desk, the blue light of his monitors reflecting off his tired eyes. He was a man who could handle a war with a rival triad, but he was defenseless against the woman who had wiped his brow when he was a boy. "There is a sickness in the kitchen, Sun Ho," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fabricated grief. She placed a stack of inventory reports on his desk, her finger tapping a column of red ink. "I tried to ignore it. I wanted to believe your kindness in hiring the American would be repaid with loyalty, but the theft is no longer small. It is systematic. Premium Hanwoo cuts, matsutake mushrooms, even the medical-grade supplements I ordered for your mother. They are vanishing." Sun Ho's jaw tightened, the ink on his neck seeming to pulse in the dim light. "You think she's selling it?" "She is desperate," Bongcha replied, leaning in until her cold, clinical scent filled his space. "My contacts in Itaewon speak of a Westerner moving high-end goods to the black market bistros. It explains her fatigue, her secrecy. But that is not what breaks my heart, Sun Ho." She paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable. She has been seen near the West Wing. I fear she is looking for more than just beef. She is looking for jewelry, for the inheritance papers. She is looking at your mother as a target, not a patient. She is gaslighting us all. Pretending to work while she picks the marrow from our bones. The seed was planted. Sun Ho had been raised in a world where the only thing more dangerous than an enemy was a parasite. To him, the idea of Shannon stealing to pay off her failures was a logical, ugly truth. He looked at the reports, then at the door leading to the surveillance hub. The trust he had tentatively extended to Shannon shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He didn't see a cook anymore. He saw a breach in his perimeter. I want her caught, Sun Ho rasped, his voice a low growl that promised a storm. I want proof that I can hold in my hand before I break her. Bangcha bowed her head, a ghost of a smile hidden in the folds of her collar. I will install the new cameras tonight, my son. We will watch her together, and we will see the thief for who she truly is. As she left the room, the shadows seemed to follow her, lengthening across the floor like the fingers of a person reaching for a throat. She had successfully turned the sun against the only person trying to save the mother, wrapping her lies in the silk of concern, ensuring that when the hammer finally fell, it would be Sun Ho's own hand that delivered the blow. The surveillance room was a digital tomb, chilled by humming servers and smelling of ozone. Sun Ho sat motionless, his fingers interlaced, his knuckles white against the dark leather of his chair. Beside him, Ms. Bangcha stood like a shadow-given form, her eyes fixed on the primary monitor. The screen was a mosaic of high-definition feeds, crystalline and sharp, courtesy of the military-grade hardware installed just hours ago. They were waiting for the kill. They were waiting for the American to prove she was a parasite. At 2:34 a.m., the kitchen feed flickered. Shannon appeared, looking more exhausted than Sun Ho had ever seen her. She moved with a desperate, frantic energy, scrounging for the stolen goods Bangcha had highlighted in her reports. Sun Ho watched with a mounting cold fury as Shannon tucked a thermos and a bundle of bread under her coat. It was a textbook theft, a betrayal captured in 4K resolution. He reached for his phone to call the security detail stationed at the end of the hall, his thumb hovering over the dial. See how she hides it? Bangcha whispered, her voice a thin needle of ice. She is heading for the service exit to meet her contact. End this now, Sun Ho. But Shannon didn't head for the exit. She turned toward the West Wing. Sun Ho's hand froze. He watched her navigate the dark hallways, her shadow dancing against the wood paneling, until she reached his mother's door. He switched the feed to the interior of the bedroom. The image that flickered to life was so visceral, it felt like a physical blow to his chest. There sat his mother, young He, perched on the edge of the bed. In the harsh clarity of the new cameras, she didn't look like a woman fading from dementia. She looked like a woman being erased by gravity. She was a ghost of silk and bone, her ribs visible through her pajamas, her eyes sunken into hollow pits of despair. What happened next shattered the narrative Sun Ho had been fed for months. Shannon didn't reach for a jewelry box or a safe. She knelt on the floor and unwrapped the bread with the reverence of a priestess. She opened the thermos, and a plume of golden steam rose into the frame. Sun Ho watched, paralyzed, as Shannon brought a spoonful of broth to his mother's lips. He expected his mother to turn away, to show the anorexic refusal Bangcha had documented in dozens of reports. Instead, young, he reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers clutching Shannon's wrist as if it were a life raft in a storm. She drank. She ate the bread as if it were the first thing she had tasted in a lifetime. She's eating, Sun Ho whispered, the words catching in a throat that had suddenly gone dry. It is a trick, Bangcha hissed, her composure finally beginning to fray at the edges. She must be drugging the woman to make her compliant. She is trying to win her favor to get to the will. Sun Ho didn't hear her. He was focused on the monitor's audio feed. The high-sensitivity microphones picked up the soft, wet sound of swallowing and the low, melodic hum of Shannon's voice. "It's okay, young he," Shannon whispered on screen, her voice thick with an empathy that didn't exist in the Gim Gang syndicate. "I made it with the beef scraps and the marrow. It's what you need to be strong. We're going to get you through this." Sunho watched his mother's face. For the first time in a year, there was light in her eyes. It wasn't the vacant stare of a mind lost to time. It was the clarity of a woman being brought back from the brink of the grave. He saw Shannon wipe a drop of broth from his mother's chin with a gentleness that he, for all his power and wealth, had failed to provide. The stolen food wasn't a commodity being traded in Itaewon. It was a miracle being performed in the dark. And the matsutake mushrooms and the hanwoo beef weren't vanishing into the black market. They were being repurposed into a lifeline for the woman who had given him life. Sunho felt a hot, searing wave of shame wash over him, followed by a cold, murderous clarity. He looked at the empty dinner tray on his mother's dresser, the tray Bong Cha had claimed his mother had refused. It was pristine, wiped clean, containing not a single crumb or drop of moisture. He turned slowly to look at Miss Bong Cha. The housekeeper's face was a mask of pale terror, her eyes locked on the screen where the thief was currently saving his mother's life. The blue glow of the monitors illuminated the truth. The only parasite in the house was the one standing right beside him. The silence in the surveillance room was no longer sterile. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a landslide. Sunho's hand moved across the keyboard with a sudden, violent precision. He didn't call his guards. He didn't scream. He simply began to rewind. He bypassed the recent footage of Shannon's mercy and delved into the digital archives of the past month, dragging the timeline back day by day, hour by agonizing hour. The blue light of the monitors reflected in his eyes, which were now fixed with a terrifying obsidian focus. He found the footage from 6 hours earlier. He watched Ms. Bong Cha enter his mother's room with the official evening tray. The audio, amplified through his headset, caught the rhythmic click of the housekeeper's heels on the hardwood. Bong Cha didn't set the tray down on the bed table. She placed it on the dresser, well out of his mother's reach. Sunho watched his mother, young he, struggle to sit up, her skeletal arms shaking with the effort. "Please," his mother's voice rasped, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Just a little water. My throat." Bong Cha didn't move to help. She stood over the bed, her shadow swallowing the frail woman. "Still being difficult, I see," the housekeeper said, her voice dripping with a venomous, practiced calm. "You'll eat when you've learned respect. Until then, you can reflect on your ungratefulness." Sunho watched as Bong Cha leaned down, her face inches from his mother's. He had no need for a lip reader now. The microphones captured every cruel syllable. "If you tell Sunho, I will make sure the nurses forget your medicine. I will make sure the room stays dark. Do you understand, you old ghost?" Bong Cha then picked up the full tray. I walked to the service elevator and disappeared. 5 minutes later, the kitchen feed showed her dumping that same fresh meal into the compactor. Sunho felt the blood in his veins turn to liquid fire. He cycled back further. 2 weeks, then 3. The pattern was a relentless, rhythmic torture. He saw his mother begging for a sip of water while the staff laughed in the hallway. He saw a nurse, under Bong Cha's watchful eye, pull the curtains shut and leave his mother in total darkness for 18 hours because she had complained too much. He saw his own mother, the woman who had hidden him in a cellar to save him from his father's enemies, reduced to licking the condensation off the window pane just to keep her tongue from cracking. The betrayal was systematic. It was a slow-motion execution carried out by the people he had paid to be his mother's shield. He had delegated his love to monsters, and they had used his own wealth to starve the life out of his family. He looked at his hands, hands that had broken men, hands that had built a multi-billion-won empire, and they were shaking. Not with fear, but with a rage so profound it felt like it might tear his chest open. He realized then that every report he'd read about dementia-induced anorexia had been a death warrant signed by Bong Cha. Every medical update from the paid doctors had been a lie designed to keep him away from the West Wing. They had kept him busy with the syndicate's wars so he wouldn't notice the one being waged in his own home. On the screen, the live feed showed Shannon gently braiding his mother's hair. The contrast was a physical ache. The outsider, the foreigner he had been told to loathe, was the only person in the entire fortress who possessed a shred of humanity. She was the only one who had seen his mother not as a target or a burden, but as a person. Sunho stood up, his chair skidding back across the floor with a harsh, metallic shriek. He didn't look at Ms. Bongcha, who was now huddled in the corner of the room, her face the color of ash. He didn't need to. The fire in his veins had reached his heart, and the cold, calculated boss was gone. In his place was a son who finally understood that his empire was built on a foundation of sand. He turned toward the door, his silhouette a jagged, dark omen against the blue glow of the screens. The time for watching was over.